All right, we're in chapter 15 of Job. So this is when Eliphaz is going to start again. And in Eliphaz's first speech in chapters 4 and 5, he had given a little bit of kindness to Job, but not a tremendous amount for sure. But when we get to this second address here in Job 15, he's not kind at all. And the three friends are beginning to get very frustrated with him, more so because he's not seeing things the way they think things are. And I think for any of us, that's a dangerous place to be. They become very short with him. And as a result, Job's going to respond. And so here's this man with these three supposed friends who aren't comforting him at all, aren't showing him any grace whatsoever. And he's dealing with his suffering and dealing with these three men, and he's frustrated because he knows that he is a righteous man. He's an upright man. God said he was. And so in this particular passage, Eliphaz, he repeats his former argument that man is a sinner and God has to punish sinners, and since Job is being punished, he must be a sinner. So the first part of his argument, he issues two warnings to Job. The first one is, Job, you lack any wisdom whatsoever. And then the second one is that God judges the wicked. So let's read verses 1 through 16 in chapter 15. Then Eliphaz the Temanite responded, "Should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind? Should he argue with useless talk or with words which are not profitable?" Now remember, before this, they had presented their speeches to him, and then Job responded, and now Eliphaz is coming back around with his speech. "Indeed, you do away with reverence and hinder meditation before God, for your guilt teaches your mouth, and you choose the language of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I, and your own lips testify against you. Were you the first man to be born, or were you brought forth before the hills? Do you hear the secret counsel of God and limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we don't know? What do you understand that we don't? Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, older than your father. Are the consolations of God too small for you, even the words spoken gently with you? Why does your heart carry you away, and why do your eyes flash, that you should turn your spirit against God and allow such words to go out of your mouth? What is man that he should be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he should be righteous? Behold, he puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. How much less one who is detestable and corrupt, man who drinks iniquity like water." I just imagine him sitting there just wagging his finger at Job as he's chewing him out there. It would be hard to be patient for sure. And so Eliphaz says, basically, Job, you don't have any wisdom whatsoever. And so in the first part of that speech, he tells Job, he said, "You're just full of hot air. You're just a windbag. You don't know anything that you're talking about." He accused his notions of being empty. In verses 2 and 3, he talked about useless words. And so what Eliphaz, he heard Job's words, but what he saw, where those words led in verse 4. "But you even undermine piety and hinder devotion to God." If everybody believed as Job believed, which is what Eliphaz is saying, that God doesn't always punish the wicked and reward the godly, then what motive would people have for obeying God? We hear that today, don't we? Religion certainly wouldn't be worth it. And there are more than enough churches in this country, churches in this world, where if you want a legalistic flavor, you won't have any problem finding one. It's rules, 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 rules. And what Eliphaz fails to see is that, Scripture tells us in the New Testament it's the grace of God that leads us to live holy lives. And so also with Eliphaz's thoughts and his theology, this is the same theology that Satan had, and he was trying to get Job to parrot it. In other words, if people only serve God for what they get out of it, then they really aren't serving God at all. They're only serving themselves by making God their own servant. Job's words told Eliphaz that Job had a wicked heart, in verses 5 and 6. And Job continuously puts forth his innocence, but Eliphaz interprets that as, well, you're really guilty. You know, it's like a kid, you're convinced that they did something, and you ask them, they say, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And what's your tendency to think? Yeah, you did. And that's the same thing with Eliphaz. And he also says in verses 7 through 10 that he lacks this wisdom because he lacks experience. You know, he tells him, he said, look, we're all three of us guys are older than your own father. How could you know better than us? And of course, as mentioned before, we all know plenty of people older than us that didn't make the best choices and were not wise. And there are some that are definitely younger that have much more wisdom than a lot of other people. And so Eliphaz gets very sarcastic with him. And this is just another proof that Eliphaz had really run out of things to say. You know, when you don't have anything else to say, just get all sarcastic. And that'll happen in a debate every single time. When someone has run out of ammunition, if you will, then they become sarcastic. And they begin to ridicule the speaker. And so Job never claims that he's the first man that God ever created, or that he was God's confidant, if you will, or that God had given him a monopoly on wisdom. And in verses 11 through 16, according to Eliphaz, Job's attitude was wrong because he refused God's help. Eliphaz saw himself and his friends as God's messengers sent to bring Job the consolation he needed. Well, if that's so, they fell far, far, far short of that task. He accused Job. He said, you know, our words are spoken gently in verse 11, but Job, your words are spoken in anger. And then in verses 14 through 16, he repeats basically his first speech, the gist of it. And so he must have been thinking, since Job refused to listen to it the first time, well, I'll say it again, and maybe he'll accept it, especially since, you know, he's only suffered more since that speech. So all of this prepares the way for Eliphaz's second warning, and that is God judges the wicked. Verses 17 through 35. I will tell you, listen to me, and what I have seen I will also declare. What wise men have told and have not concealed from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no alien passed among them. The wicked man writhes in pain all his days, and numbered are the years stored up for the ruthless. Sounds of terror are in his ears. While at peace, the destroyer comes upon him. He does not believe that he will return from darkness, and he is destined for the sword. He wanders about for food, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is at hand. Distress and anguish terrify him. They overpower him like a king ready for the attack, because he has stretched out his hand against God and conducts himself arrogantly against the Almighty. He rushes headlong at him with his massive shield, for he has covered his face with his fat and made his thighs heavy with flesh. And he has lived in desolate cities and houses no one would inhabit, which are destined to become ruins. He will not become rich, nor will his wealth endure, and his grain will not bend down to the ground. He will not escape from darkness, the flame will wither his shoots, and by the breath of his mouth he will go away. Let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself, for emptiness will be his reward. It will be accomplished before his time, and his palm branch will not be green. He will drop off his unripe grape like the vine, and will cast off his flower like the olive tree. For the company of the godless is barren, and fire consumes the tents of the corrupt. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity, and their mind prepares deception. I don't know if Eliphaz was just being mean, but in reading that and in studying that, I don't know about you, but I can think of plenty of famous people widely regarded as wicked that were quite happy, quite wealthy, quite well fed, quite rich, and lived a long life. So what Eliphaz is saying, basically, you know, God judges the wicked, and so life gets cut short. And we know that's not the case. We know believers whose lives, at least in our opinions, have been cut short. And we know believers who've lived a very, very long, full life. And the same thing for the wicked. God determines a man's days, and you know, there's no way that we can figure that out. There's no point in that. And so what he's doing in the first part, in his first speech, Eliphaz described the blessings of the godly man in chapter 5. And again, I don't know if he's ignorant or if he's just being mean, but we know lots of godly people that are very well off. We know lots of godly people that are poor as church mice, if you will. So there's no hanging your hat on that particular thing. And so in this speech, he's describing the sufferings of an ungodly man. And so Eliphaz is careful to remind Job that, hey, these aren't my ideas alone, but these were also the ideas of our forefathers. And so, Job, if you reject what I said, you're turning your back on the wisdom of the fathers. And so, as he's making this description of a wicked man, what Eliphaz is doing is he's really talking about Job and describing him. Job was in pain, he was in darkness, in trouble, anguish, and fear. Eliphaz accused him of defying God and challenging God to meet him and prove him guilty. And so he's not very subtle in his approach, and all that everyone else knew that he was talking about Job. But in verses 34 and 35, these are probably the cruelest words that he could speak to Job. He accuses him of being a hypocrite and a godless man. And he blames Job for the tragedies that had fallen on him and upon his family. That's no friend at all. Basically, he accused Job of secretly conceiving sin, and now that sin had given birth to the suffering and death. And according to Eliphaz, if you could look inside Job, all you would find would be hot air and sin. It's a very unkind person. And again, we know that Eliphaz's statement about the judgment of the wicked is not necessarily true in this life. Right? We know that in the life to come that will be true. But God doesn't want anyone to perish, and in spite of how terrible they may have treated other people, God loves even that particular person too. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 45, Scripture says that God gives sunshine to the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust, right? We know this for sure. So the greatest judgment that God could ever send to the wicked in this life, what do you think that would be? What would be the worst thing he could do to someone who was wicked? He could just totally take his hand off, his restraining hand off, and say, have it your way. And many times we know that is judgment from God, where he says, you know, you've done this, you've shaken your fist at me multiple times. If this is what you want, here you go. And you get to deal with the fallout. Job answers him, and he has 3 requests for him. First, he pleads with his friends for sympathy. Secondly, he pleads to God for justice. And finally, he pleads to God to end his life and relieve him of his suffering. So first we'll look at this plea for sympathy. That's in chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Is there no limit to windy words, or what plagues that you answer? I too could speak like you if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. Job's friends still had not identified with his situation. They were more interested in explaining why he's in the mess that he's in, rather than sitting with him and sharing in his suffering. And so he calls them miserable comforters. Earlier he had called them worthless physicians, and they're not listening to him. So all of their attempts to try and comfort him just made him more miserable. But I think it's very insightful of Job to say, you know, if I were in your shoes, I'd be doing the same thing. This is a man that knows himself. But he also says, too, that he would have treated them with more understanding than what they were showing him. In his appeal for this sympathy, Job told his friends what he was receiving from the hand of God. That's in verse 17 through 14, or verse 7 through 14, sorry. But now he has exhausted me. You have laid waste all my company, and you have shriveled me up. It has become a witness, and my leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. His anger has torn me and hunted me down. He has gnashed me with his teeth. My adversary glares at me. They have gaped at me with their mouth. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have massed themselves against me. God hands me over to ruffians and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he shattered me. He has grasped me by the neck and shaken me to pieces. He has also set me up as his target. Then his arrows surround me without mercy. He splits my kidneys open. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks through me with breach after breach. He runs at me like a warrior. I have sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. My face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids, although there's no violence in my hands and my prayer is pure. Job is just flat wore out at this point. He's just tired. He's not sure how much more he can take. His kids are gone. His possessions are gone. He can't eat. And so he's very gaunt, very weak. And he feels like both men and God are attacking him. He's hopeless. Feels like he has a target on his back and everybody's got bows and arrows and are coming after him. You know, basically he accuses God of being his enemy. And he says, I didn't attack God, God attacked me. And Job says, even if I look up, God's against me. And if I look around at my friends, he's against me. And where else am I going to go? So what we see in this next request is this plea for justice. Beginning in verse 15. I sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. My face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids, although there's no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. O earth, do not cover my blood, and let there be no resting place for my cry. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high. My friends are my scoffers, my eye weeps to God. Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. For when a few years are past, I shall go the way of no return. So, Job feels like he's in this dilemma. His suffering is so tremendous that he's wanting to die, but at the same time, he didn't want to die until he could present his case to God. Even if Job died, he'd still be restless until he'd been proven righteous. And so all throughout, what we see throughout this book is Job's repeated cry. He just wants a fair trial before the Lord. We looked at last week, he was wanting this daysman, this advocate to mediate between him and God. And so, since none of his friends are going to defend him, he feels like God needs to provide somebody to plead on his behalf. And of course, we know as believers that now we have that advocate, right? Jesus Christ, God himself, fully God, fully man, came to this earth to save sinners. That was his mission, to save sinners. And so, and as we go through into the Christmas season now, hopefully we're reminded of that. I don't know about you, but I get a little tired of it with all the commercialization and the true meaning of it is lost. And I see it creeping a little more every year. I want to say it was before Halloween, probably the week before. I went into Walmart to the lawn and garden section to find something. I couldn't find it because all the Christmas decorations are up. We're not even there yet. So hopefully we remember that during this time of year. In 1 John 1, John tells us, the apostle, that Christ gives us grace when we're tempted and tested, and even when we fail, He's our advocate that goes before the Father, and He restores us. He's our lawyer, if you will, and this is what Job wants. Job wants a lawyer to plead his case before God and convince God that he's innocent. And he's convinced that once Job wins his case, then God's going to vindicate him before his friends and restore his honor. For us today, we know that the Father and the Son are in perfect agreement about their love for us, their care for us, and their plan for our lives. And we know that the Lord lives to make intercession for His people. He also lives to perfect His people. So we come to this throne of grace and not of judgment. I think when you think about that, it really changes how you look at going before the Father. And hopefully as we go through this journey as pilgrims in this world, that we're learning more and more and more who God is, what God's like, and how much God loves us. And just that begins to change a person's life. It begins to change their perspectives. In chapter 17, the first 16 verses, what we see here is this Job's plea for death. In 22, he says he feels like death is very near. My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished, the grave is ready for me. Surely mockers are with me, and my eye gazes on their provocation. Lay down now a pledge for me with yourself. Who is there that will be my guarantor? For you have kept their heart from understanding. Therefore you will not exalt him. He who informs against friends for a share of the spoil, the eyes of his children shall also languish. But he has made me a byword of the people, and I am one at whom men spit. My eye has also grown dim because of grief, and all my members are as a shadow. The upright shall be appalled at this, and the innocent shall stir up himself against the godless. Nevertheless, the righteous shall hold to this way, and he who has clean hands shall go stronger and stronger. But come again, all of you now, for I do not find a wise man among you. My days are past, my plans are torn apart, even the wishes of my heart. They make night into day, saying, the light is near, in the presence of darkness. If I look for Sheol as my home, if I make my bed in the darkness, if I call to the pit, you are my father, to the worm, my mother and my sister. Where now is my hope, and who regards my hope? Will they go down with me to Sheol? Shall we together go down into the dust? Job's friends are not for him. They're against him. And basically, they're not willing to go and post bond for him, if you will. Someone gets arrested, and if it's a family member or a friend, you may get that phone call, hey, can you come bail me out? And these guys aren't willing to bail Job out for any particular reason. He says that people treat him now like he were the scum of the earth. All his plans have been shattered. Everything is gone. And his friends still wouldn't change their minds and come to his defense. And what he says too is that, not only would they not face the situation honestly, but they kept telling him, hey, if you do this, light's going to dawn for you pretty quickly. But you need to do this. And so what Job sees, he refuses to do that because he knows that's not who he is. He's not quite sure what the issue is. But the only way of escape that he sees at this point is just death. Just let me die. On one hand, Job wants to live long enough to see himself vindicated in front of his friends. But on the other hand, he doesn't know how much more he can take. And what Job didn't know was that God wasn't going to answer his plea for death, because God's got something much bigger in store for him. Of course, we know the end of that story and how God blesses him. And still, in spite of all of this, Job still has faith. In spite of this difficulty, he still has it. And Bildad, he's the next one that's going to step up and speak, and he's basically going to try and use fear to convince Job to see things his way. And these are some of the most vivid pictures of death that we see anywhere in Scripture. Looking at these guys, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book shortly after his wife passed away. It's called A Grief Observed. And he wrote about this painful experience. He says, "Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk to me about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolation of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand." A lot of truth in that statement. God's comfort is never given, it's always loaned. God expects us to give that comfort to others. And that's one thing that we're called to do. Beginning in Job chapter 18, what we see here is Bildad. He's going to open this speech just like he did his first speech with the words, "How long?" His friends are starting to get impatient with him because they feel like their conversation's going nowhere. We've told you this, we've told you this, we've told you this, why don't you believe? So Bildad blames Job for the stalemate, and it never dawns on Bildad that he and his friends are playing the same tunes over and over and over again. And these same tunes are, number one, God is just. Number two, God punishes the wicked and blesses the righteous. Number three, since Job is suffering, he must be wicked. And number four, if he turns from his sins, God will bless him again. They just kept going around in that circle, round and round and round. In verse 3, Bildad says that Job's not being sensible, and he's certainly not being respectable, and he accused Job of treating his friends like dumb cattle instead of like the wise men that they really were. Wise in their own sight, weren't they? In verse 4, he accuses Job of also being irritable and displaying anger instead of humility. I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty mad right about now too. I don't want to talk to these guys. And so Bildad's being very sarcastic, and again he turns to this weapon of fear. So they figured if they can't reason with him, if they can't shame him into repenting, maybe they can scare him by telling him what happens to wicked people when they die. Fear is a normal human emotion, and fear itself, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a normal emotion. We use fear quite often, right? With young kids. Look both ways before you cross the street. Well, what if I don't? You might get hit by a car. And what then? Maybe you die. I can remember, I forget which one of mine, it might have been Stuart, I'm not sure. But I told him multiple times, you need to do this, or, he would say, or what? I'd say, or you might die. And so it was so ingrained in him, I told him something totally unrelated one day, and he goes, or you might die. But it was effective, it worked for him. We use the fear of sickness, injury, or death. We use fear to keep people away from power lines. If you've ever seen the signs, in one of our rooms, it's where they route or they gain access to the power for that particular part of the building. And there's a pretty graphic sign on that door of that thing. You don't even want to walk within 5 feet of that door because you're convinced if you just brush it, you're going to die. People many times will buy insurance because they're afraid of financial loss. And certainly for some people, fear of death encourages them to get an annual health checkup, right? But Bildad makes two mistakes when he gives this speech to Job. Number one, he preaches it to the wrong man because Job's already a believer. And number two, he preached it with the wrong motive because there was no love in his heart. I know we've all heard those hellfire and damnation sermons, right? And things seem to swing in the church and it's very difficult to kind of find that middle ground. But D.L. Moody, he was a famous preacher back in the 1800s. And he drew thousands of people. In my mind, I think of him like a forerunner to Billy Graham almost. I mean, he would draw those kinds of crowds. And somebody asked him one time, said, do you ever use this element of terror in one of your sermons? And he says that normally when he would go on these campaigns, he would preach one sermon on heaven, he would preach one sermon on hell, but he was very aware that a man's heart ought to be very tender when you're preaching about hell and you're talking about the doom of the lost, potentially. And Bildad did not have a tender heart. He did not know what was happening. Ignore that bell, it's a little early. What we see in chapter 18, verses 5 through 21, is he's going to talk about these terrors of death, and he's going to paint 4 vivid pictures of the death of the wicked. So in 5 and 6, he says, a light put out. Indeed, the light of the wicked goes out, and the flame of his fire gives no light. The light in his tent is darkened, and his lamp goes out above him. You know, we associate life with light, right? It's instinctive. And we associate darkness with death. And we know, and the picture here is all of a sudden all light is gone, and the tent is in absolute total darkness. Have y'all ever been to Carlsbad Caverns or any caverns where they take you down, you got the light, they get you down there, and they turn the lights out, and that darkness is indescribable. And that's what Bildad is trying to scare Job here with. In verses 7 through 10, he then uses the picture of a traveler that's trapped. So the light's gone out, his vigorous stride is shortened, and his own scheme brings him down, for he's thrown into the net by his own feet, and he steps on the webbing. A snare seizes him by the heel, and a trap snaps shut on him. A noose for him is hid in the ground, and a trap for him on the path. And so the light goes out, the man's frightened, he jumps out of the tent, and he gets onto the road, which he thinks is a safe place, and all these other snares and traps and nets come up. And so while it looks like there's a repetition, like for instance you see the word trap twice. In English, it's just that one word, but in the original in Hebrew, it was actually 2 different words that had 2 different meanings. So there wasn't that repetition there. And so what he's saying basically is no matter whatever schemes this traveler invents, he can't escape the traps, and the more he fights and the more he tries, the weaker he comes. And so now it's dark, he's got danger around him, and there's absolutely no hope. In verses 11 through 15, he uses this picture of a criminal that's being chased. All around terrors frighten him and harry him at every step. His strength is famished, and calamity is ready at his side. His skin is devoured by disease. The firstborn of death devours his limbs. He is torn from the security of his tent, and they march him before the king of terrors. There dwells in his tent nothing of his. Brimstone is scattered on his habitation. So death is the king of terrors, what he's referring to in verse 14. And it's determined to arrest the culprit no matter where he is, where he goes. If the escaped gets up on his path and he happens to escape the traps, he's still going to get caught. And so the criminal gets weaker and weaker, and if he turns back to his tent to hide, he's got pursuers that are waiting on him there, and they're going to take him to this king of terrors with this death, and where he describes this brimstone. That's not a nice picture. It says the end of that man is fire and brimstone. Of course, we understand what that means, right? And then his 4th picture that he's going to use is a picture of a tree that's rooted up, beginning in verse 16. His roots are dried below, and his branches cut off above. Memory of him perishes from the earth, and he has no name abroad. He is driven from light into darkness and chased from the inhabited world. He has no offspring or posterity among his people, nor any survivor where he sojourned. Those in the west are appalled at his fate, and those in the east are seized with horror. Surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and this is a place of him who does not know God. So Bildad, he's talking to the wrong man. Job's a believer. He certainly doesn't have the right motive. His heart is not in the right place. And so these pictures, I can only imagine what Job was feeling at that point. They're just sinking their claws in a little bit further. And so what we see here is Job's response in chapter 19. When Bildad finishes describing the terrors, Job's going to reply by describing the trials of his life. Basically, he tells Bildad, I don't have to die to experience trials. I'm having them right now. Thank you very much. Bildad just wasn't willing to see that. So one of the trials of his life that he's dealing with are the insults of his three friends in particular. In verse 19, verses 1 through 4. Then Job responded, "How long will you torment me and crush me with words? These 10 times you've insulted me, you are not ashamed to wrong me. Even if I have truly erred, my error lodges with me." I think it's really important for us to remember that our words have the ability to help somebody or to hurt somebody, right? Sometimes what we say in jest or in fun can be really very hurtful to people, and we definitely need to be mindful of that. Okay, we'll stop there this week and pick up next week.